and diagnostically our epoch, the epoch that we inhabit. And whether you're the right persuasion or the left, or even in the middle, like a Walter Kaufmann, who was more sensitive just to the ideas and concepts and never really the politics of Nietzsche. To me, that doesn't matter. Nietzsche is Nietzsche. He set up something. It's a matter of where the force of the interpretation is. But obviously, someone who was absolutely central to the thinking of Freud, certainly to the notion of the Übermensch in the early Russian Revolution, the overman, the overcoming of man, or the new man, all came out of Nietzsche's notion of the Übermensch, and now it translated into Russian philosophy and Russian thinking during the 19th and early 20th century, and was taken up by some of the Soviet school thinkers. Then, of course, as I mentioned, after the 60s, this kind of open-ended approach to Nietzsche, where there became a new French Nietzscheanism, that was led by Deleuze, but a lot of other people participated in it, including Michel Foucault, whose great piece on genealogy and history, in which he reads Nietzsche as a thinker of stress, of Ursprung, emergence, and stress, rather than just a conceptual thinker or a stylist, as the politics of style as a Derrida takes him up. So this is a very important figure to remember, remind ourselves of it, and certainly very, very influential on Deleuze's notions of force, and of course the category of ressentiment, and this category of ressentiment is, I think, very, very important for our world. It's something very hidden, not really talked about often. Everybody's angry, but they don't know again, very, very important, this influence. And one of the reasons I wanted to read Junger, if I were, and I'm really thinking this now, maybe write a long article or something that kind of sums up how we get to wars and capital, I would begin with nihilism, that most uncanny guest. This may be the place to begin. The uncanny is nihilism in our epoch, and what does that mean? And he goes through multiple levels. So I'm kind of interested in how you take to it. Junger, again, to me, I have a bit of that old, Southern, I don't know what you would call it, growing up in New Orleans. We played sports, we played competitive things, agonistics. I had the Greek background. So I kind of enjoy the notion, if you will, or the concept of the warrior-scholar in some ways. Not the warrior like, Junger, that you're going to go into the trenches, but the warrior that sets through, challenge, competition, chance, contest in a way, the notion of the contest in a way. And again, something that I think is very valuable in terms of growth, the polemics that do not go on so much in academic life these days, because as I said, the liberal mentality, institutional mentalities, why can't we all get along? And why can't we, again, agree to disagree, right? And this seems to be the level of argumentation rather than a polemics that really begins to yield stuff. So this is part of that I would see as part of the outside war machine, although in Deleuze and Guattari, in the section for today, they seem to want to look at this from the exterior, and that state thinking would still be on the level of, this representational competition, contest, etc. But I still like this notion, if you will, of the warrior, and I want to talk a little bit about how this is structured. But anyway, any thoughts about Junger? Again, I'm not a subscriber to Junger's, solutions or what he's doing, but I do find it very across the line where he's trying to go, and examination. This is 1949, Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine. The Soviets have the atomic and hydrogen bomb, Chinese Revolution, you want to put some context on this, right, etc. So this is 49 when the quote, the Occidental, if you want to go back to that kind of language, or the West, is in this new crisis. Germany is under repair, still split, as we know. And I did tell you the story that Brecht says, don't arrest Junger, which is kind of interesting, that you would get this from Bertolt Brecht telling Stasi, leave this man alone. But anyway, again, I find it very, very interesting. Again, this notion of, the encounter with nothingness again, that this is something very, very important to subjectivity and certainly part of war in some ways, right? But I like the fundamental powers that he talks about: freedom, the fundamental power in eros, and of course, the meaning of art, right, as well. Yeah, friendship, eros, and of course, as he talks about freedom, eros, and friendship. It's a nice working triad, in terms of the nihilism. How you articulate it is another story, of course, but in many ways. So, and again, this concept of total mobilization and the worker together really gives us a sense of what's going on globally, right? In the way that you have this constant total mobilization, this constant movement, almost like platform warfare. You can move almost at any time. Troops, you can move. It's become this global game in many ways. But I think that in some ways he's anticipating much of the NATO movement in the 50s, the 60s, et cetera. He's anticipating many of the Cold War conflicts as it goes on. And again, to me, an important thinker and someone who is being read by some people on the left. I haven't read this chapter by Malm or in the Malm collection that Steve referred to, from White Skin, Black Fuel. Anyway, we used to call, of course, oil is to the residents of Louisiana and Texas, black gold, and water is now blue gold. And we have these acronyms, right? So, the Geld system always comes back in. But again, going back to Junger, I think it's important we read these people. I mean, I actually picked up when a copy of Julius Evola's Italian Nietzscheism seen from the right, on Italian fascism. Evola was again a fascist philosopher alongside Ezra Pound. And I think it's important we see where these people are really coming from as well, again, on the left. Evola was an aristocrat, who actually supported Mussolini, then broke, like Junger, was not ever really a card-carrying National Socialist in the sense of rah-rah, but, he did have affiliations early on, turned against it, and then wanted to take out Hitler. Yeah. And there is that attraction to something different. And I guess one question that really has to be asked, and this is a very radical question to me, and they bring it up, the perpetual La Botthienne question of voluntary servitude. Why do the masses, desire their slavery rather than their freedom? What is this really about? And to me, this is a very ethical question in the face of nihilism. Yeah. How does this happen? Yeah. And it's more than the masses because it's now permeating, pension programs. It's permeating professional class, choosing this path of what, Peter Bratsis and I call the security principle.
Security
principle, this domination of the drive for security only at the risk of living life. Like, give me my comfort zone, leave me alone, please don't bother me. Or as Henry Miller was quoted in The Anti-Oedipus, live with your leg amputated, live with the arm cut off, just leave me alone. Don't let me, really, I don't really want to experience life. I just want to, be secure. You know, very much like the Grand Inquisitor's reply to Christ. Why did you come back? In Dostoevsky. You know, we know what the people want. They want bread. You give them bread, everything's going to be okay, you know, in some ways. So there's a lot of psychological, again, insight in these figures. And I think it's, again, important to understand this. But anyway, I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything. I can go on to the Mille Plateaux, the treatise on nomadology, you know, which is was put out, by the way, in a little pamphlet, a Semiotext foreign agent series back when this was first released. I think it was in the 80s or early 90s. Came out in a pocketbook called Nomadology. You could just put it in your pocket. The old little Semiotext volumes that Sylvain L'Étranger had. I would suspect Chris had it. I know it. I knew it, Steve. That's why I mentioned it. I anticipated the move to the shelf. Yeah.
Okay. You know, Chris would have had this in her library.
Yes, and of course. Yeah. Good. So anyway, you know, to go back to this, the nomadology once again is this thing that, you know, was circulated in pamphlet form through L'Étranger and Jim Fleming. You know, it's a semiotext foreign. I think it was called Foreign Agent series, right? That was the Foreign Agents or Foreign. Foreign Agents. Yeah. Foreign Agents. Yeah.
Foreign Agents series. Jim Fleming and Sylvain L'Étranger were the editors of the series.
Yeah. So it's good stuff. So anyway, this book, Mille Plateaux, was first published 8 years after the Anti-Oedipus. And of course, Francois Mitterrand is elected president of France that year. You know, first socialist premier in a very long time. Certainly the first since World War, after the World War II. United States, as everybody knows, and his attempted assassin is now being released from jail. Ronald Reagan was elected in the United States. So on the one hand, you had the Reagan revolution and the, you know, so to speak, that idiocy that I think took down education. I mean, there was an opposition for a while, but it fizzled out. By the time Clinton came in, we were ready to clean up. And that's what the Democrats do. They come in and clean up, and then they change the welfare state to the workfare state. They get rid of any possibility of Medicare for all. If you all remember, Hillary Clinton wanted universal health care, but we got HMOs out of the Clinton administration. So anyway, all to say, you have this kind of political, guess what the best performing stock market was in that year? The socialist France. 1980-81 was the best performing. The CAC 40 was the best performing index in the world. So anyway, goes to show you. Alain Badiou would not get near the Mitterrand government, although a lot of people from the May 68 days and the 70s went the way of Mitterrand. They wanted their piece of the state pie. So this book to me becomes even more relevant because Deleuze and Guattari did not line up at the door at Mitterrand's office. Roland Barthes did. Jacques Derrida did. There are many, many people that did. I'm not knocking their thinking. Please don't hear me that way. They're first-class intellectuals and well-intentioned people. But you know, there were certain people that understood that this was going to go nowhere and what would happen. So, you know, and of course, as most of us know, this was the beginning, first phase of consolidation of what we call either neoliberalism, a new form of hyper-industrialization, you know, a new form of finance capital begins to emerge during this period. Yeah. And you have Reagan, the actor, then you have Clinton, the cad that comes in, and then you have the butler in the house of Clinton, later Obama, right? With a little tendency towards, you know, Bush's reaction, right? In many ways, a continuation of multiple policies. I'm sorry that, you know, I know there were some maybe good movements in there, but in general, it just seems to me that 1980 was a crucial year. So this book created quite a stir in France, you know, among the philosophical community, it was considered nonsense, right? Complete nonsense. People wrote passionately against it all over. Its biggest defender was Jean-Francois Lyotard. And in fact, he mentions this in an article right after he wrote The Postmodern Condition, that report on knowledge for the government of Quebec. So just to situate it, it's a follow-up on capitalism and schizophrenia. It's a meta-commentary, in my opinion, as a stylistic moment, it's a meta-commentary on anti-Oedipus capitalism and schizophrenia. And it's also a new invitation to what they call schizoid analysis versus that of the psychoanalytic. So you see a kind of schizoid analysis at work here. Again, the book is divided. I know we only put up the whole book, Josh, or just 12? I think 12. Yeah. So the introduction is about the rhizome, and don't attach you to the tree with roots, but to the rhizome. That's where you begin, right? The root, the radical, and the rhizome. And when you use radical, you can think of radical in this way as well, right? And the one and the multiple, the tree and the rhizome, and then it goes through this kind of direction of three directions: the Orient, the Occident, and the America. So America becomes separate. So you have a three-pronged moment here, and then then they define plateau, right? In terms of these periods early on here. Again, I wish maybe if we ever have the time to go through this systematically, it would be a lot of fun. But again, Matt, when Stanley did I know I did the lectures for him because he was not well, and you were in that class, right? Yeah. Was Mill Plateau talked about at all later by
No,
Stanley?
we read anti-Oedipus.
Right,
We didn't
okay,
do Mill.
Okay. He has the whole thing on stratums, and I mentioned, I think, a couple of classes ago, the postulates of linguistics, and with the Jemselfian prolegomena to linguistics is there, faciality, novellas, the whole thing on semiotics. So it's a very sophisticated book. I mean, I can see where certain academic specializations got very upset with this because it does kind of like, cover everything, if you will. But it's great. It's a lot of fun. It's very thought provoking. It's associative, but very firmly, I think, substantially associative. It's just not off the wall. Yeah, they know what they're talking about. So anyway, the War Machine, for our purposes, I think anticipates a lot of what the fundamental text of this course is going to be, the Wars and Capital of Alliez and Lazzarato. So again, this is structured on a Spinoza's model. And just to mention Deleuze, wrote the Nietzsche book early in his career. He wrote a book on critique. He wrote a book on structuralism, a long essay on what is structuralism. But 1968 was his coming out, so to speak, out to everything. It appeared Difference in Repetition, his major philosophical statement. Logique des sens, the logic of the sign, right? Which was his book basically on Stoic logic. So very long meditation on Stoic logic. And thirdly, the great book, formal book on Spinoza, on the theory of expression, in which he breaks down the Spinozist model, right? And so you can see in this kind of style of this chapter with axioms and propositions, the influence of Spinoza's ethics. And for Deleuze, Guattari, and Tony Negre, there is an undercurrent of philosophy that's always already happening. And this is Spinoza, Nietzsche, and then, of course, Marx, right? This is always the undercurrent. But Spinoza is the first undercurrent of modernity against those thinkers of the state, of which includes the Cartesian model, the Lockean model, all the way up through even Kant, in many ways, that they remain trapped as state thinkers. So this distinction is made very early between, those what Husserl called the civil servants, philosophy as civil servants, versus that of the outside, and then the distinctions that are made in terms of science. But we'll go through this. So anyway, the first axiom is the war machine is exterior to the state apparatus. So the war machine, all peace to C. Wright Mills, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, the military-industrial complex, in a way, is not the first moment of the war machine. The war machine precedes, right, is a much more radical way of looking at war and how this machine operates, and it's exterior to the state itself, to the state machine, right? Okay, David's in. All right, good. So anyway, he begins with, and I don't know if you know this figure, this is a book really worth reading. Georges Dumézil was a French anthropologist. Again, with, hi David, with Jungerian and Marinetti leanings at times. I remember talking to Etienne Balibar. Oh no, Dumézil is very, his correlative and comparative is leans towards fascism. But anyway, they begin with Dumézil. So anyway, first-rate anthropologist, someone who Foucault, studied with too, and learned comparative ethnography, he says, from Dumézil. So the analysis of Indo-European mythology has shown that political sovereignty or domination, that there are two heads, the magician-king and the jurispriest. This is the first page in the Rex and Flamen, the Raj and the Brahmin, Romulus and Numa, Varuna and Mitra, the despot and the legislator, the binder and the organizer. Undoubtedly, these two poles stand in opposition term by term in the obscure, as the obscure and then the clear, the violent and the calm, the quick and the weighty, the fearsome and the coagulated, the bond and the pact. So all of these things are setting up right away through Dumézil's comparative mythologies, right? This ethnographer and ethnologist, really, Georges Dumézil. Yeah, and although they expressed a division of the one or constituted in themselves a sovereign unity. So this is very interesting, the way they begin. At once antithetical and complementary, right? Again, this notion of thinking simultaneously beyond the standard sense of contraries or oppositionally, but being able to think both antithetically and complementarily, necessary to one another, and consequently without hostility, lacking mythology of conflict, a specification on one level, right, automatically, and it calls forth a homologous specification on another. The two together exhaust the field of the function. They are principal elements of a state apparatus that proceeds by 1-2. So they're very smart here, the 1-2 movement, right, that is being set up, which distributes binary distinctions, right? And how most people think, how the state makes us try to think in many ways, right? And forms a milieu of interiority simultaneously. It is a double articulation, always thinking the double and the double articulation that makes the state apparatus into a stratum. So they're going to begin here with this kind of notion of stratum. And remember, they're thinking this through at very high levels of abstraction on these plateaus, right? In a sense. So this is where they begin here. The war machine exterior. They're going to go towards exteriority in relation to the state apparatus or the state framework, because the French word apparatus is very close to the the Gestell of Heidegger, the framework. It's kind of interesting. The enframing and the apparatus serve the same function, one for the Germans, the apparatus for the French. When Althusser speaks of ideological state apparatuses, he's also, he's talking about frameworks being enframed by these moments, right? The family, right? The church, the educational system, and the media, we can add to that today. So anyway, this is where they're starting, and they begin with this thinker George Dumézil, very, very important to understand this, who did a lot of work on Indo-European mythology and actually Indian mythology too. Very, very good, very exceptional thinker. And again, mentioned as by Foucault as one of his teachers, in the discourse on language when he took the chair at the Collège de France, one of the four people he mentioned, And Foucault's very good at this. He talks about Guerrou in terms of commentary, Jean Hippolyte in terms of Hegel, who's lurking in the shadows, Dumézil, he goes through, and then Dumézil in the complementary and the antithetical, etc. Okay, so anyway, it should be noted, it will be noted, war is not contained within this apparatus. It's not part of this early 1-2, this binary state apparatus. Either the state has at its disposal a violence that is not channeled through war, right? Either it uses police officers and jailers in place of warriors, has no arms and has no need of them, operates by immediate magical capture, seizes, binds, prevents all combat, or the state acquires an army. But in a way, that presupposes, and this is important, a juridical integration of war and the organization of a military function. As for the war machine in itself, it seems to be irreducible to the state apparatus, to be outside its sovereignty and prior to its law. It comes from elsewhere. Again, very, very interesting, because we're thinking now positively, if you will, of the war machine against the state apparatus, right? This is very interesting in a way and very subversive to me. You can see where people like Subcomandante Marcos and others of our, these things are very much coming out of this, right? They understand and definitely read this. Anyway. Okay, Indra, and this is going back to Dumézil, in opposition to Varuna, no less than to Mitra. Indra, Varuna, and Mitra. He can no more be reduced to one or the other than he can constitute a third of their kind. Rather, it's like a pure and an immeasurable, and this is great, multiplicity, that is the pact, right? The pact, an eruption of the ephemeral and the power of metamorphosis. This is very beautiful, right? The eruption of the ephemeral, an eruption of the ephemeral and the power of metamorphosis. He unites, right, the bond just as he betrays the pact. And this is very interesting. The betrayal, unites the bond just as he betrays the pact, right? He brings a furor to bear against serenity, a celerity against gravity, secrecy against the public, a power against sovereignty, a machine against the apparatus. He bears witness to another kind of justice, one of incomprehensible cruelty at times. Nietzsche, we do not know how these great artists, the artists of the Urstate, come. They come without pretext. They come like fate, out of nowhere. This is very beautiful, what Nietzsche does too, because they're reading, if you will, Nietzsche, these figures, right, that come from nowhere, right? But at others of unequal pity as well, because he unites bonds, bears witness above all to other relations with women, with animals, because he sees all things, and this is great to me, not in terms of being, but in terms of becoming, right? For Nietzsche, being is an empty fiction, right? Being, yeah. Sein in German and sein des, this thing is an empty fiction. There's only becoming, right? Only process, if you will, right? In relations of becoming, rather than implementing binary distributions between states, a veritable becoming animal of the warrior, becoming woman, which lies outside dualities of terms, as well as correspondences between relations. In every respect, the war machine is of another species, and this is interesting too, another nature and another origin than the state apparatus. So this kind of sets the stage. I'm sorry to read the whole beginning, but I think it's necessary just to get us into a good rhythm for this book that's built on many levels of, avant-garde music too.
Yeah.
So anyway, any comments? This is the beginning. They're going to use Dumézil to begin to break down these binaries. They want to say that the state apparatus itself is still bonded, and they'll repeat this, to representational thinking. And we went through this last time for those of you that did the Heidegger, when we were talking early on in the age of the world picture and the questions concerning technology, how representational thinking needs to be broken, right? Etc. We spoke about this in terms of Benjamin, in terms of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. This problem always in the aesthetic sphere of reduplication, revisiting, reforming the same old things, being recycled, etc., in terms of form. So again, they're pushing to the outside, completely to the outside, the break with this kind of inside-outside opposition to really go fully to the thought from the outside, right? Okay, so this is the brief. Yes, Steve. Yeah.
Just a question, because I'm trying to get more of a grasp on this idea that the war machine precedes the state. I'm wondering if this would be an example of it. Would the white people's extermination of the indigenous population of North America before the time the U.S. was established, would that be an example of that, or would that be a bad example?
That's not a war machine.
No, that's a state.
That's a state.
But it preceded the establishment of the United States.
It's a state. It's a state doing that. If you read Geronimo as a hero in Custer's Last Stand, that is the war machine fighting back in a certain way. Yeah. Yeah. The movie I think of here, and I wrote this, I think when I looked at this last, I noticed it in my notes, and I'll go to this, is City of God. I don't know if you've seen that film, the Brazilian film made 2002, but I put this about, the collective mechanisms of inhibition and how they're breaking down, immanent relations, etc. The whole notion of pact and bond. So what's really being taken up here is this old distinction between the pact and the bond, right? They're really trying to look at this. They're trying to look at, what happens in terms of betrayal as well. There are many levels here, Steve, that's working. So yes, the United States, the white man coming in, and a great filmic example of this is Werner Herzog's Aguirre, Wrath of God. One way of looking at this is in the rafts in the Amazon, Cortez, colonizing the Indians, when the colonizers bring the Bible, right? And they give it to the natives, and the natives put it up to their ear. They can't hear anything. They're shaking their heads, right? So this is a very interesting moment about what maybe the war machine was on the other hand, right? In a way, yeah. So yeah, could be a good filmic example. Let me just go on. So anyway, I want to go down just a little bit to the next thing. Let us take a limited example and compare the war machine. And this is the first move of examples. And I find this very interesting if you know games. This is a very interesting section. The example and compare the war machine and the state to the context of the theory is games. First of all, I play chess. So I know chess as a game of coding, decoding, and it's a game of warfare, but it's a game of the state. It's the move of the state. And for those of you know Brzezinski, whatever that guy, what's his name? Ziggy, the ex-secretary of state, Clinton administration. His daughter's on TV now, right? Anyway, he wrote the book, The Great Chessboard, right? And then of course the book on Dulles Brothers, The Devil's Chessboard. So chess has always been, and in fact, Wittgenstein, language is like a game of chess analogies throughout Saussure. Again, these are enemies to Deleuze and Guattari in a sense that chess is for state thinkers in some ways. But let's go on. The chess pieces are coded. They have an internal nature and intrinsic properties. So this is very important. You know, the bishop has a certain value, intrinsic properties, moves a certain way on the board. There's situations and they have qualities. The knight remains the knight, the pawn is that. Each is like a subject of a statement endowed with a relative power. If you're looking at a chessboard, you look at the formation. Where's the knight's positions? Where's the bishop's position in terms of the center of the board? Where's the line of attack? You begin to see all these things. Combined in the subjective enunciate of the chess player or the game's form of interiority. Go pieces, on the other hand, the game of the Orient, are pellets, discs, simple arithmetic units, and have only an anonymous, and this is very interesting, an anonymous collective or third-person function, like being in the Chinese restaurant versus that of the Italian restaurant in some ways. Very interesting. How does the kitchen work? What is the decision? How collective? You can maybe make that. So it makes a move, not Boris Blatsky. You know my age now, anyway, or Bobby Fischer, or Gary Kasparov. I can update a little bit, but anyway, not the person, but it makes a move in Go. It could be a man, a woman, a louse, an elephant, whatever. Go pieces are elements of a non-subjectified machine assemblage with no interest, only situational ones. This is very interesting. When you begin to think only situational elements here in the Go pieces, right? The relations are very too different. Within the milieu of interiority, chess pieces entertain bi-univocal relations with another and the adversary's pieces. Their functioning is really structural. This is again interesting. On the other hand, a Go piece has only a milieu of exteriority or extrinsic relations with nebulas or constellations, right? According to which it fulfills functions of insertion or situations, such as, and these are great for, moments in terms of warfare, bordering, encircling, and shattering. All by itself, a Go piece can destroy an entire constellation synchronically. Very, very interesting. A chess piece cannot or can do so diachronically only. Chess is indeed a war, but an institutionalized, regulated, coded war with a front, a rear, and battles. Yeah. But what is proper to Go is war without battle lines. Again, with neither confrontation nor retreat, without battles, even pure strategy. Interesting, right? Whereas chess is a semiology.
It's interesting,
right? Yeah. So finally, the space is not at all the same in chess. It's a question of arranging a closed space for oneself, thus of going from one point to another, of occupying the maximum number of squares with a minimum amount of pieces. And that really is, I mean, I taught chess back in the day to a couple of young people. I mean, I used to do that in another lifetime, but I would always have a formula. You want to look at pawn structure, you want to look at force, but the main thing is who to move, right? How do you control the center? All these kind of things, time and spatial relations. You begin to see this on the board. We're using the minimum of pieces to guarantee the most force. So very important. In Go, it is a question, and this is the difference. And look at the verb of arraying oneself in an open space. Arraying oneself, of holding space, maintaining the possibility of springing up at any point. The movement is not from one point to another, but it becomes perpetual without aim or destination, without departure or arrival. The smooth space, and then now they're going to make a distinction that's crucial to their understanding of the war machine. The smooth space of Go as against the striated space of chess. The nomos of Go against the state of chess, nomos against polos. And again, the Greek word nomos is the opening. Nem is for nomad, NEM, the root, and then nomos means the custom, the law, these kind of things versus the polis, right? The state. The difference is that chess codes and decodes space, whereas Go proceeds differently, territorializing or deterritorializing. It can make the outside of territory in space, consolidate that territory by the construction of a second adjacent territory, deterritorialize the enemy by shattering his territory from within. I don't know if any of you apply to deterritorialize oneself by renouncing and then by going elsewhere. You can make different constellations on the board. And it's very interesting if you study GEOP and the building of tunnels during the Viet Cong, moments. This is very, very crucial to understand how guerrilla warfare was able to take on state codification in some ways. In many ways. By renouncing another justice, another movement, and another space time. And then he quotes Nietzsche. Then they quote Nietzsche. They come like fate without reason, consideration, or precept. In some way, the incomprehensible have pushed right into the capital. At any rate, here they are. It seems every morning there are more of them. Luc de Honch, a Bantu myth that leads us in the same scheme. And he goes through the Bantu myth. So anyway, from the standpoint of the state, the originality of the man of war, his eccentricity necessarily appears in a negative form: stupidity, deformity, madness, illegitimacy, usurpation, and sin. Dumézil analyzes the three sins. And this is good too. And this is stuff we don't really get in school, right? We don't really read George Dumézil very deeply, right? We don't really begin to think this through. I mean, this is what's great. Okay, so the European against the king, against the priest, and against the laws originating in the state. The three sins, right? A sexual transgression that compromises the distribution of men and women, or even a betrayal of the laws of war as instituted by the state. The warrior is in the position, and I like this very much, the warrior, again, is in the position of betraying everything. And they'll go back to this with Achilles in terms of how Achilles is seen by Kleist in Penthesilea, in this great play of Kleist, including the function of the military or the understanding nothing. It happens that historians, both bourgeois and Soviet, I like the way they do this, right, will follow, right, this negative tradition and explain how Genghis Khan understood nothing. He didn't understand the phenomena of the city, an easy thing to say. The problem is that the exteriority of the war machine in relation to the state apparatus is everywhere apparent, but remains difficult to conceptualize. It is not enough to affirm that the war machine is external to the apparatus. It's necessary, and this is very important, to reach the point of conceiving the war machine as itself a pure form of exteriority, whereas the state apparatus constitutes the form of interiority, right? We habitually take as a model according to which we are in a habit of thinking, right? So instead of us, we're going to complain about Biden and Medicare now in the United States, or Biden and abortion. If the war machine is really working, we go out and we start figuring out ways, how can we confront this attack upon our social, quote, umbrella system, our parachute system, or our safety nets, et cetera, and form alternative political agencies in this regard. That's what the war machine is going to think. Instead, we're just accustomed to thinking, again, we have a vote, we have the electoral machine politics, the state's going to do this. How do we prepare? We need to invest even more in our pensions. So instead, we don't build the war machine that is necessary. And again, you can see, in some ways, how really in some way, at least in the beginning, it didn't turn out that way, but in the beginning, how radical the Panthers were. They had acupuncture, they had medical treatment centers alongside the breakfast programs, the education moments, et cetera. This was a war machine. This is why they went after it. Yeah. To go back what Steve Knight was saying earlier about, the US, the white European settlers, right, coming in. Yeah. Well, I mean, the natives revolted, right? In many ways, and had to be put down in some, many ways. So what happened to Vietnam? You destroy all the arable land. You make sure that people are punished completely for the next 50 years because they dared to stand up. Vietnam is very similar to, instead of the reparation that Haiti has been paying forever, Vietnam is paid with, some of the most fertile arable land in the world is destroyed by biochemical warfare. Really, in many ways. So anyway, to go back to this, sometimes it's confused with the magic violence of the state, and other times with the state's military. For instance, the war machines invent speed and secrecy, but there is all the same a certain speed and a certain secrecy that pertain to the state relatively secondarily. So the great danger of identifying the structural relation between two poles of political sovereignty and the dynamic interrelation of these two poles with the power of war. Dumézil cites the lineage of the Roman kings. There is a Romulus-Numa relation that occurs throughout a series with variants. So again, they're starting to think through series, right? Very, very interesting, this kind of serial thinking. That Sartre speaks to, by the way, later, and most of you know that serial music was a real advance in terms of 12-tone systems in the Schoenbergian, Bergian, Webern moment. So anyway, sorry, I got something in my eye. That occurs through a series with variants and an alternative between these two types of equally legitimate rulers. But there's also a relation with an evil king, Tellus Hostilius, right? Tarquinius Superbus, an upsurge, right? Or Superbus, an upsurge of the warrior as a disquieted and illegitimate character. Shakespeare's kings could also be invoked. Even violence, murders, perversion do not prevent the state lineage from producing good kings, but a disturbing character like Richard III slips in. And now, announcing from the outset his intention to reinvent a war machine and impose its line, deformed, treacherous, and traitorous. He claims a secret, close intent, totally different from the conquest of state power, and other relation with women. In short, whenever the eruption of war power is confused with the line of state domination, everything gets confused or muddled. The war machine can then be understood only through the categories of the negative, since nothing is left that remains outside the state. But return to its milieu of exteriority, the war machine is to be of another species, a completely different nature, and of another origin. One would have to say it is located between the two heads of the state, between the two articulations, not necessary in order to pass from one to another, but between the two, in that instant, even ephemeral, if only a flash, it proclaims its own irreducibility. The state has no war machine of its own. It can only appropriate one in the form of a military institution, one that will continuously cause it problem. This explains the mistrust states have towards their military institutions, right? In that the military institution inherits an extrinsic war machine. Von Clausewitz, who we've mentioned, and I'll go back to him more when we get to Wars and Capital, has a general sense of this situation when he treats the flow of absolute war as an idea that states partially appropriate according to their political needs and in relation to which they are more or less good conductors. So trapped between this two poles of political sovereignty, the man of war seems unmounted, condemned, without a future, reduced to his own fury, which he turns against himself. The descendants of Hercules, Achilles, Ajax have enough strength left to proclaim their independence from Agamemnon, a man of the old state. But they are powerless when they come to Ulysses, a man of the nascent modern state. And this gives you another kind of reading, if you will, of the first chapter of the Dialectic of Enlightenment, Odysseus, or the myth of enlightenment. This is a very, very different approach to that notion of the modern state, Adorno and Horkheimer may be doing. I always like this kind of cross-fertilization because these people, Deleuze and Guattari have read the Frankfurt School. They just don't qualify. Right? And they're not going to engage in a dialogue. This is not the way that most of the French operate. The first man of the modern state. If you start to think this through, and even go to Joyce, Leopold Bloom, as the figure of the 24-hour destruction of the beginning of liberal capitalism, right? It's basically the end of liberal capitalism is really Ulysses, the modern Ulysses. Everyday life, the 20-year journey is condensed into one day life in ordinary man in Ireland, right? In Dublin. Very, very interesting when you think about that. What is that relationship to the modern state? It is Ulysses who inherits the arms of Achilles, only to convert them to other uses, substituting them to the laws of the state. And this is interesting too, because Ulysses, or Odysseus, if you will, as a character, is one who believes in nostos, the return home, right? The return to the homeland, if you will, right? This is more powerful than immortality. If you remember the Odyssey, Ulysses or Odysseus in Greek is the choice between immortality with Circe on that island versus that of a return home. He chooses to return home versus immortality. That is his choice. And not Ajax, who is condemned by the goddess he defied and against whom he sinned, right? Yeah. No one has portrayed the situation of the man of war. And this to me is very important because this, again, is part of the aspect of this kind of writing and this kind of thinking theoretically that is very fruitful. At once eccentric and condemned, better than Kleist, Heinrich Weinclaus, a contemporary of Johann Wolfgang Goethe, right? and of course Hegel, right? Achilles is already separated from his power in Penthesilea. The war machine is passed over to the Amazons. And this is interesting because here comes the feminist moment, right? In terms of the feminist as warrior, right? Right? This is not first wave feminism or second, in a way, or Julie Firestone and our friend Ellen Willis in a sense, or, even going back earlier to de Beauvoir, and maybe even earlier to the 18th century around, Mary Shelley's father and mother. So anyway, a stateless woman people. Hi, David. We're on page 355 on the War Machine as exterior to the state. The first axioms, and we're reading the section on Heinrich von Kleist and his relationship to Goethe and the War Machine, whose justice, religion, and loves are organized uniquely in the war mode. Right? Descendants of the Scythians, the Amazons, spring forth like lightning. Between the two states, the Greek and the Trojan, they sweep away everything in their path. Achilles is brought before his double, Penthesilea. You know the story. Penthesilea kidnaps Achilles because she wants to be trained in arms, right? In fighting, to be trained as better warriors. This became the beginning, right? And in the ambiguous struggles, Achilles is unable to prevent himself from marrying the war machine or from loving Penthesilea, and thus for betraying Agamemnon and Ulysses both at the same time, the two brothers. Yeah? And of course, most of us know from our reading of the Iliad that Achilles is, quote, the question of Achilles in action and then going into battle is part of the theme of the first, part of the Iliad before the Odyssey. The second part, of course, is the return home, right? Yeah, the great warrior. Okay, and thus, nevertheless, he always belongs enough to the Greek state. This is interesting, that Penthesilea for her part cannot enter the passional relation of war with him without herself betraying the collective law of her people. The law of the pact, right? This is interesting. The law of the pact, right? That prohibits choosing the enemy and entering into a one-to-one relation on binary distinctions. work, Kleist, and I suggest reading Kleist. I mean, he's brilliant, all of his work, right? In a way. Goethe did not like his plays. They tried to destroy him, of course. Kleist was the up and coming, the playwright. Anyway, but typical Deleuze and Guattari, they're going to take up the underdog against, the thinker of the state. And Goethe and Hegel are enemies in terms of state thinkers. So Kleist celebrates the war machine, setting it against the state apparatus in a struggle that is lost from the start. Albert, Arminius heralds a Germanic war machine that breaks with the imperial order of alliances and armies and stands forever opposed to the Roman state. But the Prince of Hamburg lives only in a dream and stands condemned for having reached victory in disobedience of the law of the state. As for Michael Kohlhaas, the war machine can no longer be anything more than banditry. And this is where he goes into banditry. It is in the destiny of the war machine, when the state triumphs, to be caught in the alternative, either to be nothing more than the disciplined, military organ of the state apparatus, or to turn against itself, to become a double suicide machine, a solitary man and a solitary woman. This is in the form of a question. Is it the destiny of the war machine? Goethe and Hegel, state thinkers, both see Kleist as a monster, and Kleist has lost from the start, right? Why is it then that the most uncanny modernity actually lies with Kleist? This is interesting, right? It is because the elements of his work are secrecy, speed, and affect. Very, very important. And in Kleist, the secret is no longer a content held within a form of interiority. Rather, it becomes a form identified with a form of exteriority that is always external to itself. Similarly, feelings become uprooted from the interiority of a subject to be projected violently outward into a milieu of pure exteriority that lends them an incredible velocity. And this is important too, a catapulting force. Love or hate, they are no longer feelings, but they become affects, right? And these affects are so many instances of the becoming -woman, becoming -animal of the warrior, the bear, the she-dogs. Affects transpierce the bodies like arrows. They are weapons of war. The deterritorialization velocity of affect. Even dreams, Hamburg's Penthilias, are externalized by systems of relays and plugins. Its intrinsic linkages belong to the war machine. Broken rings. This exterior element of exteriority dominates everything, and which Kleist invents in literature, which he is the first to invent, which give time, and this is again very important, a new rhythm, an endless succession of catatonic episodes or feigning spells, flashes or rushes. Catatonia is this affect is too strong for me, and a flash is the power of this affect sweeps me away, so that the self, or the moi, is now nothing more than a character whose actions and emotions are desubjectified, perhaps even to the point of death. Such is Kleist's personal formula: succession of flights of madness and catatonic freezes in which no subjective interiority remains. There's much of the East in Kleist. The Japanese in fighter, you can think of the No Theater and also the Kabuki dance here, very much, and the Shadow Warrior, very interesting. Interminably still, who then makes a move, right? Let go. You break up a whole formation by one pellet, one disc, which sets up a whole new thing. It's called Atari. You capture the space, right? And it comes like lightning out of nowhere. Yeah, too quick to the Go player. Many things in modern art come from Kleist. Goethe and Hegel are old men next to Kleist, right? There we go. Yeah, yeah. Could it be that at the moment the war machine ceases to exist, conquered by the state, but then it displays to the utmost its irreducibility, that it scatters into thinking, loving, dying, or creating machines that have at their disposal vital, revolutionary powers capable of challenging the competent state. Is the war machine already overtaken, condemned, appropriated as part of the same process whereby it takes on new forms and undergoes metamorphosis, affirms its irreducibility and exteriority, and deploys that milieu of its pure exteriority, and the Occidental man of the state, or the Occidental thinker, continually reduces to something other than himself. This is the beginning of the war machine as exterior. Any thoughts, David Winters? David South has come late, but this is very powerful stuff. Josh has Feist being kind of the thinker of the avant-garde in art in some ways. This is again, so it's being set up here as a lot of things that begin to play out against representational space and against, what we traditionally consider military industrial complex, power complexes, etc. Very, very interesting the way they're setting this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say just very quickly, Michael, the relation of police to the state that they describe on page 352 is something that I've struggled with for as long as I've been reading this piece, which is a long time now. Not in any, I find it interesting. I think it's interesting too in the context of what we'll see from Lazzarato and Alliez as well, and how they put those elements sort of in dynamics with each other over time, right? Which is a big part of that book.
You're speaking about the apparatus of the state, the violence that is not challenged through war, using police officers and jailers in place of the warriors. Is that what?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So like either the state has its. So one of the things that I think about in that moment and in Wars and Capital as well is whether it's useful to think of the police as always already an outgrowth of a state, or are there empirical sort of historical moments where police sort of act like something other than state and other than war machine, with something like a logic unto themselves, the way that they're crediting the state and the war machine with that kind of logic. And so like one of the questions that I've been thinking about for quite some time is whether or not policing has that kind of same, whether it's always subordinated to the state or whether it sometimes seems to have its own vector.
No, that's interesting. I'm gonna recommend a book. I'm sorry, again, you know me, right? So it's a very interesting book by Jacques Delzola, who was a friend of Deleuze's. They were colleagues. The book is called The Policing of Families. And it's this notion of policing vis-a-vis the state, and Delzola goes into what social work really is, right? Yeah. What state statistics really are. Et cetera, et cetera. It's a very interesting attempt to look at some of the questions you're raising here. Yeah, in many, many ways. What is policing? How does it function in terms of the state apparatus? Take on a life of its own.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll check that out for sure.
About this. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just saying thank you for that. And when we get into Wars and Capital too, I think it remains a really interesting question within that text, right? Because I think they kind of assume what Deleuze and Guattari write here, which is that policing is part of the state. And so as in Wars and Capital, as they develop this kind of neat dynamic, I feel like policing still gets just wrapped under that umbrella. And so I think it remains an interesting question to sort of play with through the next book. What is their status? And especially because Lazzarato and Alliez are giving us the historical timeline, it introduces the question of do the police function differently in different geographies, in different historical moments, within different antagonisms. I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. We'll go there. We'll hold that. That's a very good position there to talk about. Yeah, Patrick, please. Yeah.
You mentioned Adorno Horkheimer earlier, but I mean, I'm thinking of Benjamin's notion of lawmaking violence, and it seems to be something. I mean, for Benjamin, it's like there is the violence which creates law, which creates a state. So there really is kind of this sense of violence on the one hand, but also the state comes into existence out of that. And Ulysses, I think, is an example, and Adorno and Horkheimer essentially use that in the dialogue of enlightenment.
Yeah.
But here, and this is a question,
Yeah.
here it's almost like what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about are two different ways of organizing society. One, basically the state, and the other one, basically the war machine.
Mm.
And there's not a transition from one to the other. These are really alternatives.
That's correct. It's very
Yeah.
good. Very, very, I mean, to my mind, very, very good insight and brings a lot of clarity. You know, it is, you know, in Claus' phrase, society against the state is
Right.
the machine as an exteriority. And this is not an evolutionist or an in-between model that's happening. There are two different alternatives. There are two different poles in many ways. And going back to what David Winter was saying, of course, Althusser had the insight, and they obviously have read Althusser and they know this, between the repressive state apparatuses, which include the police.
Mm.
And we've seen this, you know, some of the great things filmically, once again, is the Battle of Algiers, the torture scenes. You see what the French were capable of, you know, in this movie. Montagorva presents it so vividly and so, I think, very accurately in many ways, that opening scene of what's going on and the electric shocks and all of this that were happening. But from there, this repressive state apparatus, which includes the police, right, et cetera, to the ideological, the thought police, you know, in a sense. So where Deleuze and Guattari are trying to go, at least in my mind, is thought becomes a war machine too.
Mm-hmm.
Theory is a war machine. That's really the political move here, in a sense. You know, whereas you still think within representational politics, right, and think traditionally within that representation, you're just a functionary of the state. You become part of, you're part of the institution. You become part of the problem, not part of the solution. All of these things are really going on here. So the real task here, I think you point out very well through Benjamin's critique of violence, right, and Gewalt, which is also a play on his name, you know, Walter is part of the German model of Gewalt, in violence. That for Benjamin, you know, the violence that is not captured by the state is the divine violence, right? He makes these distinctions between the divine and the mythic. So in some ways, the divine violence, I mean, again, I'm being the pedagogue here, so to speak, but a good essay could be on divine violence and the war machine, right? How those two are very well connected between a peripheral Frankfurt School person and Deleuze and Guattari, even though they don't cite the divine violence here, you know. So in some ways, divine violence is not, again, it's a kind of deterritorialization. You know, they're always looking, as you know, from the reading of, Anti-Oedipus, they're always looking for these moments of deterritorialization, and they're looking for schizoid affect as well. So they're going to take up Kleist, the underdog, the one that's, set out, in a way, to kind of give them the insight of how do we go against this state functionary representational thinking? How do we get out of this trap? To say that somehow Patrick Patterson's Social Security will be there because Joe Biden is a benevolent Democrat, he'll plead with Congress to please keep it there, and his Medicare, et cetera, or Michael Elias or whatever, instead of us going off and forming our own war machine, which would be taking over buildings, making clinics, changing the dynamic of the society at large, right, in a way. Unfortunately, our idea of the war machine exterior is this kind of, idiotic, mass shootings that we're getting. Fortunate thing in the United States, how misdirected this is. And then, of course, the categories just come up. It becomes a pathology, a personal pathology, right, et cetera, instead of something that is part and parcel of the American way of life. As some people have said, it's amazing it doesn't happen more. It's actually under control in some ways. So I don't know about that, but in some way. But yeah, divine violence is all throughout the critique of violence, Steve, by Benjamin. I don't have a copy of it with me, but he makes distinctions. Mythic violence, by the way, is Sorel. The myth of the general strike is a mythic violence in Sorel. It's the myth of the left. That's the violent myth of the left, is the general strike. Sorel gives us this thing. Divine violence is more aimed at justice. Yeah, in a sense, right? So they're going to speak about this too, in many ways. Yeah. Deleuze and Guattari, they're going to talk about this going back. So anyway, let me just go on. We'll yeah. So this is again very interesting. This is set in the Occidental framework, right, against the Orient. So you're beginning to see here this movement where they've made this notion of the Spinoza, that the sign is from the East. The sign is not from the West anymore, right? Across the line, it's to the East. That's, in some ways, at this point, right? So as their way of warding off the formation, right, of a state apparatus or its equivalents in a group. So this is the first question they ask after this axiomatic. Is it possible to ward off, to set up a defensive, moment against this, right? And very much like a Platonic question, how do we defend against Sparta? We keep losing, right? Very interesting, right? So he goes on to that's the problem. So the second proposition, the exteriority of the war machine, is also attested to by ethnology, attributed to the memory of Pierre Clostes. If those of you that don't know, Pierre Clostes was one of the best students of Claude Lévi-Strauss, one of the two great students. The other one was, what's his name? Lucien Sebag, who actually committed suicide. Clostes died at 37 years old, contacting some tropical disease while, studying people in Peru, right, etc. So anyway, his great book is called Society Against the State. Right, he's also wrote a book called The Archaeology of Violence too, right? So anyway, primitive segmentary societies have also been defined as societies without a state. In other words, societies in which distinct organs of power do not appear. But the conclusion has been that these societies did not reach the degree of economic development or the level of political differentiations that would make the formation of the state apparatus both possible and inevitable. The implication is that primitive people don't understand so complex an apparatus. The prime interest is of Clostes' theories is they break with this evolutionist postulate, right? Not only does he doubt that the state is the product of an ascribable economic development, but he asks as if it is not a potential concern, and again, they're very, very much oriented towards this formation of the Urstaat. What was this primary state? These people that come out of nowhere, based on the Nietzschean, proposition. Okay, but he asks, is it not a potential concern of a primitive society to ward off or avert that monster that they supposedly do not understand? Warding off the formation of the state apparatus, making such a formation impossible, would be the objective of a certain number of primitive social mechanisms, even if they are not consciously understood as such. To be sure, primitive societies, and this is interesting, they have chiefs, but the state is not defined by the existence of chiefs. It is defined by the perpetuation or conservation of organs of power.
Yeah.
The concern of the state is to conserve. Special institutions are thus necessary to enable a chief to become a man of the state. But diffuse collective mechanisms are just as necessary to prevent a chief from becoming one. Mechanisms for warding off, preventive mechanisms, are a part of chiefmanship and keep an apparatus distinct from the social body from crystallizing. Clausius describes the situation of the chief who has no instituted weapon other than his prestige. Very interesting, right? No other means of persuasion, no other rule than his sense of the group's desires. The chief is more like a leader or a star than a man of power, and is always in danger of being disavowed, that is, abandoned by his people. Very interesting, right? You want to think about how the star system works. Very interesting. You have a lot of insight here, I think. You know, these are people, yeah, anyway. But Clauser goes further, identifying war in primitive societies, excuse me, as the surest mechanism directed against the formation of the state. War maintains the dispersal and segmentarity of groups, and the warrior himself is caught in a process of accumulating exploits, leading him to solitude and a prestigious but powerless death. He then evokes natural law while reversing, excuse me, its principal proposition, just as Hobbes saw clearly. And again, very important, that the state was against war, so war is against the state. Anyway, and it makes it impossible. It should not be concluded that war is a state of nature, but rather that it is the mode of a social state that wards off and prevents the state. Very interesting. They're looking at really this Ursprung, if you will, this originative moment of what is war, right? What is the war machine really about? And interesting, right? Very, very interesting here. Yeah. And I go on. I'm sorry about a little congestion tonight. Okay. It should not be concluded that war is state, but rather the mode of a social state that wards off and prevents the state. Primitive war does not produce the state any more than it derives from it. It is no better explained by exchange than by the state. Far from deriving from exchange, even as a sanctum or sanction for its failure, war is what limits exchanges, maintains them in the framework, right, of alliances. It is what prevents them from becoming a state factor, from fusing groups. So this is interesting to think through today, right, where we are with the whole question of sanctions and economic sanctions vis-a-vis the Ukrainian situation and what alliances are being North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What is this alliance? What is the European Union and all of this, you know, as these moments. So the importance, right, of this thesis is first of all to draw attention to collective mechanisms of inhibition. So they go back to their hyphen psychoanalytic anthropological insights. These mechanisms may be subtle and function as micro-mechanisms. This is easily seen in certain band or pack phenomena. For example, in the case of gangs or street children in Bogota, Jacques Mourier cites 3 ways in which the leader is prevented from acquiring stable power. The members of the band meet and undertake their theft activity in common, with collective sharing of the loot, but they disperse to eat and sleep separately. And also, especially, each member of the band is paired off with 1, 2, or 3 other members. So if he has a disagreement with the leader, he will not leave alone, but will take along his allies, whose combined departure will threaten to break up the entire game. Finally, there's a diffuse age limit, and at about age 15, a member is inevitably induced to quit the gang. This is very much the structure of City of God, if you've seen the film. Very much the structure, yeah, of what's happening in terms of, you know, the gang warfare in Brazil. This is not, yeah, in this, not in Colombia. So outside Rio. Finally, there's a diffuse, yeah, the age limit in 15. Age 15, a member is inevitably induced to quit the gang. These mechanisms cannot be understood without renouncing the evolutionist vision that sees bands or packs in a rudimentary and less organized social form. Even in bands of animals, leadership is a complex mechanism, does not act to promote the strongest, but rather, and this is important, I think, does not promote the strongest, but rather inhibits the installation of stable powers in favor of a fabric of immanent relations. One could just as easily compare the form high society life to the form sociability among the most highly evolved men and women. High society groups are similar to gangs and operate by the diffusion of prestige. Remember the Dorothy Parker Circle at the Gramercy Park Hotel? There are many, many examples of this. You know, the old Algonquin Hotel, the Round Table there. Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt in Saratoga Springs with Richard Wright and Bunny Wilson and all this cast of characters. The Prestige and Center of Powers. The Yale Club, the New York Racket and Tennis Club, you know, all of these things, the club atmosphere, etc. Then references to centers of powers as in social groupings. Someone used to say, I mean, this was many years ago, I can get better stock market information in the steam bath at the New York Racket Club than I can at any of the Wall Street firms, right? So this used to be, you know, this form of prestige, you know, you go to the sauna. Okay, Proust clearly showed, and I like again this move to literature, the non-correspondence of high society values and social values. This, of course, is in the section on the Megalese and the Germantes way, of which Deleuze, by the way, wrote a brilliant book on the semiology of Proust called Proust and Signs. He wrote a book on remembrance of things past. A very, very good book on the semiotics of the various paths in the Proustian landscape, right, etc. Eugene Sue, a man of high society and a dandy, whom legitimists, Marx couldn't stand the Eugene Sue, the Mysteries of Paris, by the way, couldn't stand it, too much lumpen. Anyway, and a dandy whom legitimists reproached for frequently the Orleans family used to say, I am not on the side of the family, I side with the pack, right? Interesting. Packs, bands, are groups of the rhizome type as opposed to the arborescent type that centers around organs of power. So they're going to set up this, again, this distinction between the rhizomatic, right, and the tree, again, right? This is another thing. That is why bands in general, even those engaged in banditry or high society life, are metamorphoses of a war machine formally distinct from the state apparatuses or their equivalents, which are instead what structure centralized societies. We certainly would not say that discipline is what defines a war machine. Discipline is the characteristic required of armies after the state has appropriated them. The war machine answers to other rules. We're not saying they are better, of course, only that they animate a fundamental indiscipline of the warrior, a questioning of hierarchy, which is interesting, right? Perpetual blackmail by abandonment or betrayal, and a very volatile sense of honor, which once again impedes the formation of the state, right? Very interesting, right? Yeah. So again, you know, and look, you can read the Western, the good Westerns in this light too, right? The James brothers. You can read, you know, Billy the Kid, Billy, they don't like you being so free, right? Etc. Posse, where if you know that film, and the black, you know, African-American groups right around the Spanish Civil War that became bank robbers too, right? They were militant, but went out, had no respect for the hierarchy, for the officialdom, but became bandits, became, you know, the outsiders in many ways, okay? So the impediment, which I like very much, the formation of the state, right? Okay, but does that argument fail to convince us entirely? We follow Claus when he demonstrates that the state is explained neither by development of productive forces, which is the standard Marxist, you know, attempt, by the way, nor by a differentiation of political forces. It is the state, on the contrary, that makes possible the undertaking of large-scale projects, the constitution of surpluses, the organization of the corresponding public functions. The state is what makes the distinction between governors and governed possible. We do not see how the state can be explained by what it presupposes, even with recourse to dialectics. The state seems to rise up in a single stroke as an imperial form and does not depend on progressive factors. It is on the spot emergence, is like a stroke of genius, the birth of Athena, right? We also follow Claus when he shows that the war machine is directed against the state, either against potential states whose formation it wards off in advance, or against actual states whose destruction it purposes. No doubt the war machine is realized even more completely in the barbaric assemblages of nomadic warriors than in the savage assemblages of primitive societies. In any case, it is out of the question that the state to be the result of a war in which the conquerors imposed. By the very fact of their victory, a new law on the vanquished, because the organization of the war machine is directed against the state, form, actual or virtual. The state is no better accounted for as a result of war than by a progression of economic or political forces. This is where Clausewitz locates the break between primitive counter-state societies and monstrous states. Yeah, this is, again, another interesting distinction. Monstrous state societies whose formation is no longer possible to explain. He is fascinated, and as am I, by the problem of voluntary servitude in the matter of La Boétie. In what way do the people want or desire servitude, which most certainly did not come to them as an outcome of an involuntary and unfortunate war? Where did this come from? This is a very good question here. I think this is an extremely radical problematization. They did, after all, have counter-state mechanisms at their disposal. So how and why the state? Why did the state triumph? The more deeply Clausewitz dealt in the problem, the more he seemed to deprive himself of the means of resolving it, right? Here they go. He tended to make primitive sizes, hypostasized, self-sufficient entities that insisted heavily on this point. He insisted heavily. He made their formal exteriority into a real independence. He remained an evolutionist then and posited a state of nature. Only this state of nature was, according to him, a fully social reality instead of a pure concept. And the evolution was a sudden mutation instead of a development. On the one hand, the state rises up in a single stroke, fully formed. On the other, the counter-state societies use very specific mechanisms to ward it off, to prevent it from arising. We believe that the two propositions are valid, right? But the inner linkage is flawed. There's an old scenario from clans to empires. You know the books. We see them every day. New York Times bestseller. Barbara Tuchman, we see all kinds of different historians that write this way, from bands to kingdoms. But nothing says that this constitutes an evolution, since bands and clans are no less organized than empire kingdoms. We will never leave the evolution hypothesis behind by creating a break between the two forms, that is, by endowing bands with self-sufficiency in the state with an emergence, all the more miraculous and monstrous. So we are compelled that there's always been a state to think, always been a state, quite perfect and quite complete. The more discoveries archaeologists make, the more empires they uncover. The hypothesis of the Urstadt seems to be verified. The state clearly dates back to the most remote ages of humanity. It is hard to imagine primitive societies that would not have been in contact with imperial states at the periphery or in poorly controlled areas. But of greater importance is the inverse hypothesis that the state itself has always been in a relation with an outside and is inconceivably independent of that relationship. The law of the state is not the law of all or nothing. State societies are counter-state societies, so the argument with Clausewitz is here, but that of interior and exterior. The state is sovereignty, but sovereignty only reigns over what it is capable of internalizing, of appropriating locally. Not only is there no universal state, but the outside of states cannot be reduced to foreign policy. Very interesting. That is, to a set of relations among states. The outside appears simultaneously in two directions. Worldwide, huge machines branched out over an entire ecumenon at any given moment, which enjoy a large measure of autonomy in relation to the states. For example, commercial organization or a multinational type, or industrial complexes, or even religious formations like Christianity, Islam, certain prophetic or messianic movements, but also the local mechanisms of hands, margins, minorities, which continue to affirm the rights of segmentary societies in opposition to the organs of state power. The modern world can provide us today with particularly well-developed images of these two directions: worldwide ecumenical machines, but also a neo-primitivism, a tribal society as described by McLuhan. These directions are equally present in all social fields, all periods. It even happens that they partially merge, right? For example, a commercial organization is also a band of pillage, right? Or piracy. You know, we say this about the Greek ship owners. They're just pirates of the high seas. And believe me, they're really making off in this war, Anyway, for part of its course and in many of its activities, or it is in bands that a religious formation begins to operate. What becomes clear is that bands, no less than worldwide organizations, imply a form, right, irreducible to the state, and that this form of exteriority necessarily presents itself as a diffuse and a polymorphous war machine. It is a nomos, very different from the law. The state form, as a form of interiority, has a tendency to reproduce itself and remains identical to itself across its variations and easily recognize it within the limits of its poles. Always seeking public recognition, there is no masked state. But the war machine's form of exteriority is such that it exists only in its own metamorphoses. It exists in an industrial innovation as well as in a technological invention, in a commercial circuit as well as a religious creation, in all flows and currents that only secondarily allow themselves to be appropriated by the state. It is in terms not of independence, but of coexistence. And this is important too, in competition, in a perpetual field of interaction that we must conceive of exteriority and interior, war machines of metamorphoses and state apparatuses of identity, bands and kingdoms, mega machines and empires. The same field circumscribes its interiority in states, but describes its exteriority and escapes states or stands against states. So it's very interesting here how it's not an either or, right? This is very interesting coexistence, right? Competition in this field, if you will, they call it a perpetual field becoming, right, of interaction, right? That you begin to conceive of the notion of what's on the outside, the war machine, and then the interiority that plays out, in many ways. So I think that this is very, very crucial here. So, gang warfare, bands, right? All these kind of formations, right? Very much so. One example that comes to my mind, and I hope someone takes this up in a scholarly way, or in a rigorous, thoughtful way, is the case of the Lafitte brothers in Louisiana. They were pirates, right? In Barataria, two Jewish brothers. And Barataria was their operation, which in Cajun French means bargain land, Barataria. They controlled the swamp areas in Louisiana. John Lafitte was a blacksmith. That was his day job, so to speak, but pirate as well. He had the blacksmith shops in the French Quarter. He loved Napoleon. He built a house for Napoleon to come out, which is now a famous bar on Toulouse Street in the French Quarter. And Lafitte, built this house when Napoleon never made it to Louisiana. But Lafitte is most famous for two things, and I think I've mentioned this, one of the aspects. The main thing he's famous for is he controlled the blockage of British ships getting into New Orleans for the Battle of New Orleans and Chalmette during the War of 1812, of which Andrew Jackson was victorious in this way. So Jean Lafitte was absolutely responsible. This gang, this marginal, right, character, right, in many ways, the pirate, right, not a man of the state by any means, right, but an outsider who really ran a piracy, At the same time, right after he was hailed by Jackson as being, integral to the war effort, one of his ships sank a ship on the high seas, of which his fiancee's sister, the governor of Louisiana's daughter, was on, right? Of course, Lafitte had to leave the country. He was completely, the state, came down on him, basically threw him into exile. He ends up in Manchester, England. He meets Frederick Engels years later, and supposedly, according to Paul Virilio's archival research, may have been part of the financing of the original manifesto of the Communist Party. In English, the original pamphlets. So it goes to show you how an outsider, the exterior, right, in a way, becomes part of the interior for a while, right, becomes part of the state apparatus, but then is thrown out again to the outside in the void, and then becomes part of a movement that is against the dominant state. The problem for Deleuze and Guattari is that Marxism, the state makes you sick, the new state will make you well, is still statism, right? This is their problem, right, with all of this. This is what the background proposition is. The state apparatus has made you sick, but the new state, the Leninist rupture, the communist or socialist state, will make you well, right? For them, this is a replacement of one with the other. It's reduplication. It doesn't really change anything. It's not becoming. It's not radical enough. It's still within this tree, if you will, right? In some senses. This is their argument against Freud, too. Their argument with Freud was the family makes you sick, makes you neurotic. The psychoanalysis in the new role of the new family, the masked family, in which the analyst can play the multiple roles of the family and interpret at that level, makes you well. For them, it's still the family, right? Still reproducing something that is already there, part of this bourgeois framework. So I think this is, maybe one thing that's helpful if we take a step back from this and try to understand it, right? And in terms of what they're trying to do here with the state. I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is, again, it's not the easiest go. It's not like reading, or doing the New York Times crossword or reading about mental illness in America today in the Times Magazine sections. But anyway, yeah, very difficult. But the real issue here, once again, is the perpetual field of interaction. We forget about this, right? We were always thinking in these binaries, either the state or outside, either the exteriority or the interiority, right? But for them, the proposition that's playing out here is the war machine is an exteriority, right? First of all, right? This is really what's going on, and they're trying to go through this. And I really love, I'm going to reread Claustrus. I have his book, The Archaeology of Violence, here, and I have the other one in Brooklyn. But anyway, I want to reread his Archaeology of Violence, because they loved him very much. And those of you, when we were doing the anti-Oedipus, you remember how much of anthropology Deleuze and Guattari were drawing on, especially Guattari, who knew a lot of these people and studied with them. Yeah. Probably the best education you can get is a high-powered, psychiatric clinic in the south, in France, outside of Paris, circa 1950, 1960. You get all the good stuff, so to speak, right then, in terms of education. So anyway, and the next section is on epistemology, which I also find very interesting in terms of the division between royal science and what we could call people science. So they're thinking here very radically, very interestingly enough, stuff we've forgotten to do in some ways. We have forgotten this, in a lot of ways. So yeah. So any thoughts up to now, or David Winters, anything else? Peter Bratsis is going to join us. He'll tell us about the state, since he wrote a book on everyday life in the state. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that'll be a lot more interesting than anything I have to say, for sure.
No, I'm not. I don't. Peter's not going to even show his face, but he's here. Yeah. Anyway, he's
Oh,
on the Greek island. He's not going to tempt us with the beautiful. Well, it's 2 in the morning there. 3 in the morning. He's still up. Yeah. I'm sorry. Good. 3 in the morning. Yeah. Hi, Peter. You notice Peter has a red wristband on his watch now. You know, it's a real true communist. Red wristband. You know, not black or black. He has a red band on his watch.
It's the anarcho-communist.
Anarcho-communist. Yes, that's right. Combination. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, good. Yeah. We've just been going over Deleuze and Guattari's Middle Plateau and the thinking of the state and the state apparatus.
Yes.
That of the war machine is
Methodology.
and then, of course, Pierre Closs's, formulas of society against the state, warding off against the state functions, which they do not agree with, that they work with in terms of a perpetual field of coexistence that integrates, to think of exteriority and interiority somewhat, simultaneous. And now we're going into proposition 3, which is the epistemological section, which I think is excellent, by the way. This is where our friend Rick Wolf could rewrite knowledge in class in some ways. Propose that. But anyway, so proposition 3. But anybody want to say anything? Again, I want to, say that they're in this process like good chess players of decoding and not especially recoding right away, going to the game of Go, because they use these 2 games, the striated space, smooth space of the Go game versus the striated space of chess. Right? These are the 2 spaces. Go has a much more open space. Yes, David, yes, please.
Michael, what I was wondering is just in encountering this and feeling it's amazing, it's complex, it's confusing, is there an example of like an actual political state system at war that you could use that would flesh out what they're talking about in a more direct way? I think that would just be so illuminating. I just feel a bit lost where it's so abstract.
Well, to me, there seem to be very good models that would take place in the 60s and the 70s, especially in the Foucault theory of, Che Guevara. And then, of course, in the general GEOP strategies of encirclement, encampment, using borders, et cetera, the dispersal of the Go machine, that use of the game, right? In terms of, you upset with just one surprise attack everything. So to me, these are kind of examples in military, history, if you will, that you could use as concrete examples of this, right? It's not exactly the North Vietnamese state that's fighting against US state imperialism or against Western imperialism. It's a group of configurations, right, that are fighting in, various villages and things like this that are taking on, this seems to be a principle of guerrilla warfare that's, very different than these traditional notions. So they're trying to get rid of this earlier Clausewitzian, idea of warfare and the warfare state, right? That is wars against states, that there's somehow this marginal element, this exteriority war machine that is happening. Also, in some ways, if you read in history, this use of literature of penthesilea is very good. That's really worth reading because, the story of Penthesilea in Greek myths is that she kidnaps Achilles so he can train them, the Amazon women, in weaponry and the use of the weapon in a much more sophisticated way. He falls in love with her, et cetera. There are all kinds of stories around this, but this begins this outside war machine of the Amazon women, right, in many ways. So they're looking at these becomings that go well beyond just self, right, things, the becoming warrior, the becoming woman, the becoming animal, right? So they're trying to look at this again, in this processional way, it's a processional element always, not static, not only static and dynamic like in old war terms, or the second, the principles of thermodynamics, but something beyond that, right? In many ways.
But
So,
for example, how would they, analyze something like the United States policies in the Middle East? I'm thinking of Iraq or Afghanistan, where it seems to me like it is more complex because the United States has wanted to consolidate a kind of hegemony of power, of saying we can go there and kind of dispense an earlier, quotes, more, in quotes, primitive mode of tribalism by Pashtun warlords, people like this, to say we are going to impose a state on you which has very little interiority for you. You are just going to have to put up with us telling you what to do. And also, it's kind of atemporal in some way of saying we've sort of drifted there without a kind of telos that wars usually have. And so how would they address the idea that the United States doesn't seem to be, and other states as well, like this is true of Russia, they seem like they just want more state stability, not less. And they actually get, to some extent, more state stability. I mean, in some ways, the United States is arguably, in a negative way, more stable by dint of drifting into 20 years of war with these places. We have more control of oil, power, money, other types of things that are kind of ill-gotten gain, but they don't seem like they really destabilized us. And even with changes of parties, like switching from the Bushes who started it, it's not like having a Democratic president rolled it all back at all. Barack Obama did drone strike more people than Bush had. I'm just trying to put this together with sort of actual politics, and there's some kind of gap. What would you say?
well, I mean, I would say you're absolutely right. There's a major gap here, but for them, this is predictable, right? What's going on, right? In terms of the dominant state apparatus, in terms of the dominant, way that war is looked at. Drive for global domination, etc. I mean, I'm not so sure. Look, is the Taliban in its way, it's very regressive, it's tribal and all of that. Did the United States really go in 20 years ago with the intention of having the Taliban in charge of government in Afghanistan, or taking over the government again, right? In a sense. But this seems to be, modeled on this. And you're right, in a sense. I mean, that, bin Laden's an asset, then turns against them, then he has to be taken out because he turns against, being, one of them, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I understand all of this. But again, I think they're looking at again, this war machine that is taking place beforehand. And where do we see examples of that is a better way maybe of looking at it. Are there pockets? Are there places in which this has been successful, right? And where are those moments again? Remember, I mean, they're theorizing here. This is not Pentagon 101 or sophisticated, They're really trying to break down, right, if you will, the dominant thinking about the war machine, right, et cetera, right? That it is a state-controlled moment, right? So, yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's a very good question about why is the power, even greater today? But is it really? That's another question. Can we think in some ways of, the Eurasian Economic Union as an attempt to break up, if you will, the Western dominance? Are they onto something here in terms of these new polarizations that are taking place globally? Is there that real hegemony of the United States still? Certainly there is in terms of nuclear capacity, right? Military power and muscle. We know this. But in terms of cleverness, in terms of economic, sanctions, all of these things, are we really? Because look at what's going on. You say we're stable at this point, but at the same time, we're facing a country right now that's going through a kind of semi-economic shock to its after 12 years. I mean, I'm sure you hear this from your patients and or other people, that they can't believe the price at the supermarket, or they can't believe the price of gas, et cetera, and all these repercussions that are going on. So is this really having a desirous impact, right? Or is it more this kind of universe of which, the quote unquote global elites, which, I like Pepe Escobar's phrase about Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, Dumb and Dumber 2, the remake. But anyway, are these moments, right, completely so short-sighted that, basically it becomes, a suicidal move of the state? And there are historians such as Alfred McCoy that are beginning to see this, that we're at the moment on a plateau of an empire change. So this is another thing. Yeah.
Perhaps it's not unlike what happened with Britain, which really became drastically destabilized in the 20th century, and in some ways has never really recovered from the War of World War II, which had a sense of breaking up a sense of imperialist rule that could no longer sustain itself. It had overreached.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the difference is that the United States doesn't need the colonies like British did so much either, because you have the Midwest and you still have oil production, and fracking is still a bit, business. And we're going back to coal and natural gas, and we have all these forms of pragmatism. And it's a very different animal in terms of its imperial. I think we have to understand that about, this too, and how global it is too, how sophisticated it is global. What Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do, at least in my mind, is they're trying us to think beyond that of just, we're trying to think what's at the base here of a war machine. What are the possibilities for a war machine? And that war machine becomes, about women, about minorities, about, it becomes very different than, the usual nation states, alliances, ethnicities, etc. It's more about, the kind of movement politics of the period. So yeah, but I mean, it's hard to say, whether or not, at this point. I mean, from what I know, I mean, I'm no expert on this, and not privy, but it seems to me that we're going through some kind of geopolitical shift right now. We might not see it in a lot of our lifetimes here, but it seems to me to be really happening, in a sense that the sophistication has really, the rest of the world is caught up, in many ways. Look, in 1970s, we used to joke, all the Arabs were sending their kids to Harvard Business School. Well, it happened, right? Then somehow, after shock treatment in Russia, the Russians the oligarchs started sending their kids, to Harvard and Wharton, right, et cetera, or to Stanford. The Chinese communists, right, the post-Maoist moment, right, many are here, right, et cetera. I remember in the East Village the last time I think I had a coffee, many, many moons ago, I met the third in command's daughter of the Communist Party, who has a $3 million flat in the East Village, right, as she goes to college, right? So yeah, anyway, I mean, I hear what you're saying. But again, I think the point is here is again, this phrase of, it is in terms of not of independence, right, which is our way of thinking so much, but of coexistence and competition in the perpetual field of interaction that we conceive of exteriority and interiority. They're really trying to think of this proposition, war, as an exterior, the war machine is exterior, right, from the outside. It is not something that is brought to you by the state, right? At the same time, they're trying to look at the originative moment of the state. They're fascinated by the Nietzschean phrase, where do these people come from? These founders of the Werkstatt. I think I read the proposition. I mean, I know where it is in Nietzsche. I couldn't get it off the table, but they recited it here. So again, it's the Kleistian, Artoian machine, if you will, against the state that is really happening here. The thinkers of the state are, the Harvard historians, the School of Government, et cetera, the old men of the state, et cetera, right? MI6, that would be considered, part of the state. Not to say, because Mossad has read Deleuze and Guattari very carefully.
Mm.
This I know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's another thing that's interesting in all of this, that of all the theorists, they're not reading Althusser so much. They're not reading, they're reading this because they're interested in space, territory, occupation, etc. Right? Very interesting.
Right. But Michael, what would for them interiority actually look like? I'm not sure I get what that is or what's being.
What's how things become interiorized by the state.
But like, can you give an example?
Is everything, the state bureaucracies, the
Uh,
public works. They talk about this very much. These all become interior to the state.
so it becomes like a state department, a state function, a
Something
bureau
like
of transportation.
that.
That's for them what the interiority is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It says the state has no war machine of its own, right? It can only appropriate the war machine, in the form of a military institution, one which will continually cause it problems, right?
Mm.
Right? This is the issue, right? This explains the mistrust that states have towards their military institutions. Yeah.
Mm.
They're very good on this too. Yeah, 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 yeah. So yeah, and again, they're looking also at a warrior class too. I mean, they're not they're not trying to just say we're academics sitting back from this. They're really, in a sense, really looking beyond the usual cast of subjectivity or the self. These are archaic terms to them. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, so they're getting rid of the notion, or they're divorcing the state from the war machine. Essentially.
There's no evolutionist moment, right? From the tribe, the clan, if you want to think of it that way, from the gang, there's no evolution into the state in the way they're thinking of it, which is also what they claim about Costres until the end, that he somehow becomes part of that evolution tendency.
And that the war machine, in a sense, is an update on the idea of kind of like permanent revolutionary way. I mean, I see this as.
I think so. I mean, perpetual revolution.
Yeah.
Perpetual becoming. Again, there's no such thing as being. The old debate between, Parmenides and Heraclitus is irrelevant to Deleuze and Guattari. There's only becoming.
Here.
It is anti-foundational. Yes, good point, Matt. Thank you. Yeah, very anti-foundational in many ways.
I don't know. Have you read Jameson's book, The Dual Power in the Universal Army, where he talks about refunctioning the military? I mean, is it serious, or is it? I mean, could we see this? Could we see this as Jameson is trying to use this idea here?
Right.
I thought about that too.
Yeah. Right. It may be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
He gave that talk to the Left Forum. It was a fundraiser.
Right.
It's on YouTube if you want to hear the conversation.
Oh no, I think I've seen it. Yeah, several of them. I've read the book. Yeah.
It was at the Graduate Center, not the Left Forum.
Yeah.
Sponsored by the Left Forum. I'm sorry. Yeah. In some ways, that's very, very true. Yeah. I mean, think about if you had an army during COVID, how many lives may have been saved if healthcare had been in the hands of, a good war machine, so to speak. In many ways, we lost. I mean, just think of the per capita losses in the supposedly hegemon of the world economies. The ratio here in the United States. Well, I'm not in the United States right now, but anyway. The ratio in the United States, the loss of bodies compared to its population versus the rest of it, right? Not only in terms of just cases, but deaths, which is even a better, I think, a greater measurement, because it shows the inadequacy of the public health system, how bad it is. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is, it's a travesty, right? In some ways, we had no functionaries, etc. The big issues were whether the nurses had to be vaccinated, or this is what the issues came to, in a sense, instead of infrastructural, issues, in my mind. Yeah. So Jameson is good on this in a certain way, how to. I'm not saying I take him totally to heart on that, yeah. But he was serious, and I know this for a fact. Very serious. He just didn't write this as to be provocative. He was very serious. Yeah. So anyway,
If you look at it
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead, Josh. Yeah.
but if you look at it, the idea, I don't think he wrote it in that way, but if you look at it through this text, like Patrick was saying, it kind of takes a new dimension though.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, Jameson, took up Deleuze and Guattari in the postmodern, the book on postmodernism that he did too, the schizoid, and certainly did this in filmic culture as well. Yeah. Anyway, why don't we go on? I'll come back to what David Salvage brought up too, and also the policing David Winters. I think we'll see the more contemporary work, because remember, this is dated 1980. So this is post, Vietnam, right? Still 5 years, 5 years after, the airlift, supposedly, out of Vietnam, 1 year after The Deer Hunter came out, 3 years after Who'll Stop the Rain, I think 3 years after Coming Home with Jane Fonda and John Voight, if you remember that.
And Bruce Dern.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So all of these moments. So the Alliez that we go to next, Wars and Capital and Lazzarato, is 2018. So it's an update 38 years later. And there are arguments with this, but I want us to see this at work, because again, I am of the persuasion again that unless the left, I mean, again, I'm thinking this through in terms of the future, unless we build a real economy of care and really start saying that no more electoral politics is possible, it's not going to go anywhere, and we start building alternatives, forget all this high-powered thinking that has preceded us, predated us, has given us great things to think about and praise, etc. But we have to build those alternatives. And for me, when you start thinking about this kind of war machine and think about it in the sense that this could be certain models of which we start to think through things going forward, might get us somewhere, at least to start thinking it through. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah. Because state apparatuses, again, and the state itself form these institutions which have completely failed in some ways, almost completely failed. Most of the people in the United States, the great majority of people. Look, we're overfed, we're over medicated, we're over-consumptive. We have all these things, right, in so many ways. We're not happy. We're not that creative at this point. I think it's very important to recognize this and say, hey, is there something we can do? I mean, for me, luckily, I'm a cheerful nihilist in some ways. And I can say, all right, I got it. But at the same time, to build, for the people of the world like David Winters and Josh, who are just coming up, right? And Bratzis's middle way, in a sense, what is being done, in a way. Yeah. I mean, in so many ways. Yeah. So, to me, this again opens up a lot of things, right? The state clearly dates back to the most remote ages of humanity. Hard to imagine, right, that primitive societies that would not have been in contact with imperial states, much like the primitive society of Barataria in Louisiana. You can go through many levels. I've seen this at work. You can think about gangs, how gangs are brought into the system, right? many ways, right? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. The law of the state is not the law of all or nothing, right? But that of interior and exterior. The state is sovereignty, but it only reigns of what it is capable of internalizing, right? Or appropriating locally, right? Not only is there no universal state, but the outside of the states cannot be reduced to foreign policy. That is, to the set of relations among states, right? In many ways. Yeah. Yeah. So this is very important. Now, let's go on to proposition 3 about this epistemology, because this gets back to a little bit of the fun of the work here. The exteriority of the war machine is also attested to by, right, epistemology. So again, we're getting the evidences of this exteriority, which intimates the existence and perpetuation of what they call a nomad or a minor science. And this is very, again, important and something we might be able to take up, in many ways. The nomad or minor science. I know some of you know the journal, probably Science for the People, that used to be out there, Radical Science. These were really good journals that broke down very technical language into layman's terms, really were educational devices. I don't know if you guys knew the person, Phil Brown from Brown University, who was a psychologist who broke open testing, both psychological testing and SAT testing. He broke down all the codes, psychologists, etc. What's really going on, how to deconstruct the Minnesota multiphasic personality test, all these kind of things, DSM 1 through 6, I think it is. Anyway, I had a friend that did a Foucaultian analysis of this, the taxonomies involved. I think this friend had 23 different categories in DSM 6, right? Yeah. Anyway, okay. So there's a kind of science or a treatment, and this is proposition 3, right? And the beginning of nomad science against dominant or royal science. And I like the way they set this up: nomadic, minor science versus royal science. They do the same thing with literature. Minor versus traditional major literature, which to me is very interesting because it opens up the possibility of reading other fiction that is assigned, that doesn't make it into the university canon until the author's dead or half dead or has burned themselves, on 2nd Avenue in front of St. Mark's Church in the East Village or something like that. All right. So anyway, seems very different to classify, whose history is even more difficult to follow. What we were referring to are not technologies in the total sense, the usual sense of the term, but neither are they sciences in the royal or legal sense established by history. According to a recent book, and this is a very good French historian, by the way, Patrick, someone Jameson does not like at all, Michel Serres, but he's a very good historian of science, French historian of science. Both the atomic physics of Democritus and Lucretius and the geometry of Archimedes are marked by it. The characteristics of this kind of eccentric science would seem to be the following, and this is good. And again, this kind of eccentric science, and that's nomadic, out of center, decentered science, if you will, would seem to be the following. It uses a hydraulic model, number 1, rather than being a theory of solids, treating fluids as a special case. Ancient atomism is inseparable from flows, and flux is reality itself, or consistency. 2, the model in question is one of becoming and heterogeneity, as opposed to the stable, to the eternal, the identical, and the constant. This again upsets any kind of notion of security or politics of identity. This is a very interesting proposition in that sense. It is a paradox to make becoming itself a model and no longer a secondary characteristic, a copy in the Timaeus. Plato raises this possibility, but only in order to exclude and conjure it away in the name of royal science. By contrast, in atomism, just such a model of heterogeneity and of passage or becoming to the heterogeneous is furnished by the famed declination of the atom. here we go. And Peter's, I don't know if he went out for a while, but this is Althusser in some ways, right? The swerve, Epicurus. The clinamen, or the minimum as the minimum angle, has meaning only between a straight line and a curve, the curve and its tangent, and constitutes the original curvature of the movement of the atom. The clinamen is the smallest angle by which an atom deviates from a straight path. It is a passage to the limit, an exhaustion, a paradoxical exhaustive model. The same applies to Archimedean geometry, to which the straight line, defined as the shortest path between 2 points, is just a way of defining the length of a curve in a pre-differential calculus. One no longer, number 3, goes from the straight line to its parallels in a laminar flow, but from a curvilinear declination to the formation of spirals and vortices as on an inclined plane, the greatest slope for the smallest angle, from turbo to turbo. In other words, from bands or paths of atoms to the great vortical organization. The model is a vortical one. It operates in an open space throughout which things flows are distributed rather than plotting out in a closed space for linear and solid things. It is the difference between a smooth, and again, another notion again that they're using, the smooth vectorial projective or typological space, right? And a striated metrical space. In the first case, space is occupied without being counted. And in the second case, space is counted in order to be occupied. Very interesting, going back to Go and chess again, smooth and striated space in terms of theories of games, etc. Josh, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
I think where you're in the application to, to state war would make sense in a way, like how wars are actually fought now.
Yes.
States, co-opting the war machine basically, and these
absolutely
in the sort of more traditional ways that we used to play chess with.
Right. Finally, the model is problematic rather than theorematic. Figures are considered only from the viewpoint of the affections that befall them: sections, ablations, adjunctions, and projections. One does not go by specific differences from a genus to its species, or by deductions from a stable essence to the properties deriving from it, but rather from a problem to the accidents that condition and resolve in it. This involves all kinds of deformations, transformations, passages to the limit, operation in which each figure designates an event much more than an essence, right? Very important. The square no longer exists independently of a quadrature, the cube of a cubature, the straight line of a rectification, right? Whereas the theorem belongs to the rational order. Very, very interesting, and I'll mention this. Deleuze's wife was a mathematician, a very good mathematician, her name, Fanny Deleuze, by the way. Yeah, so anyway. Whereas the theorem belongs to the rational order, the problem is affective and inseparable from the metamorphoses, generations, and creations within science itself. Despite what Gabriel Marcel, who, if you don't know, was a Jesuit philosopher, he wrote a book on the mystery of being, was a Christian existentialist. Must they say, the problem is not an obstacle, it is the surpassing of an obstacle. In other words, a war machine, right? A surpassing of an obstacle. This is interesting again. How do we get beyond the obstacle? How do we cross the line, right? What is this war machine? How do we get to? All of this is movement is what Royal Science is striving to limit this movement, right? When it reduces as much as possible the range of the problem element and subordinates it to the theorem element. So this goes back, and I mean, I'll just bring up Heidegger in a way, and also Althusser again. It's really the question of the history of the question that must be asked. What is the history of the question that is being asked? What is the problematic? How do you problematize? How do you begin that framing of the question and problematizing, not especially how do you apply axiomatically, theorems, deductively, superimpose this, et cetera, et cetera. And I promise you 80 to 90% of people are educated, by this theorem imposed moment rather than this approach here, right? So the Archimedean science, or this conception of science, is bound up in an essential way with the war machine, right? The problemata are the war machine itself and are inseparable from inclined planes, passages to the limit, vortices, and projections. It would seem that the war machine is projected onto an abstract knowledge, formally different from the one that doubles the state apparatus. This is important. It would seem that a whole nomad science develops eccentrically, one that is very different from the royal or imperial sciences, right? Furthermore, this nomad science is continually barred, inhibited, or bound by the demands and conditions of state science. Don't take that alternative too seriously. Don't go there too seriously. No, it can't be helped. You have to have the operation. You know all the codes here, right? You take a pill, take a shot, they won't tell you what you got, right? You know the Bo Diddley song, right? Yeah. Anyway, so anyway, there's a confrontation here with modern medicine and the new demands and conditions of state science, right? Archimedes vanished while the Roman state becomes a symbol. This is interesting. The Roman Imperium. The fact is that the two kinds of science have different moments of formalization, and state science continually imposes its form of sovereignty on the inventions of nomad science. State science retains of nomads only what it can appropriate. It turns the rest into a set of strictly limited formulas without any real scientific status, or else simply represses and bans it. As if the savants of nomad science were caught between the rock and a hard place, between the war machine that nourishes and inspires them, and the state that imposes upon them an order of reasons, right? Very interesting. Very, very French in a way, looking at deductive systems, right? Very Cartesian here. And this is interesting too, because the French have this ability to go against the theoretical underpinnings of most of modern, allopathic medicine, right? We know, very much, that this is really a Cartesian moment in terms of what we still live, right? We're seeing this, and it's institutionalization. And I think they're very good at undoing this, trying to problematize it according to reasons, right? Deductive reasons. An order of reasons is actually a phrase that they're using from a French philosopher named Martel Guéroult, who was the main Cartesian scholar, one of a great commentary. He used order according to reasons. And by the way, for those of you that, I know Patrick knows Descartes, in the discourse on the method, the third method is to do things not in natural order, but according to its order of reasons. The first is to be, clear and distinct, so that things are rendered clearly and distinctly to you, self-evident, right? The second, of course, is to separate the part from the whole, break the problem down into its parts to reconstruct it in terms of a whole. The third is to set the problem in terms of its order of reasons, which is not a kind of natural sequence, but built on the order of reasons. And the fourth model of the method is to be as comprehensive, to leave nothing out, right? This is the French way of doing royal science, and really the model, if you will, or the deductive system. It's more, those are the four reasons given of the method, right? In many ways, right? So anyway, the four sufficient rules of logic. I'm sorry, the sufficient rules of logic as you go apart into the Cartesian method. So anyway, all to say, going back to this, the antagonist obviously is Cartesian, models, right? Since state science retains only what it can appropriate the rest into a set of limited formulas without any real status, represses and The figure that's very interesting here of the engineer, in particular the military engineer, right, with all its ambivalence, is illustrative of this situation. Most significant are perhaps the borderline phenomena in which nomad science exerts pressure on state science, and conversely, state science appropriates and transforms the elements of nomad science. This is true of the arts of encampments, castrometation, which is always mobilized, projections and inclined planes. The state does not appropriate this dimension of the war machine without submitting it to civil and metric rules. So this moment of, again, calculated metrics is coming back in. That strictly limit, control, localize nomads, and without keeping it from having repercussions throughout the social field. Vauban and suffers, as a repeat of Archimedes. It is true of descriptive and projective geometry, which royal science would like to turn into a mere practical dependency of analytic or so-called higher geometry. Thus, the ambiguous situation of Monge and Poncelet as savants. It is also true of the differential calculus. It only had parascientific status and was labeled the Gothic hypothesis. Royal science only accorded the value of a convenient convention or a well-founded fiction. The great state mathematicians did their best to improve its status, but precisely, and this is important, on the condition, and this is how thought works. I mean, in many ways, if you think about it, how thought becomes institutionalized. The great state mathematicians did their best to improve its status, right? The differential calculus, but precisely on the condition that all the dynamic nomadic notions such as becoming, heterogeneity, infinitesimal, passage to the limit, continuous variation be eliminated, and civic, static, and ordinal rules be imposed upon it. Carnot's ambiguous position in this respect. So what you have here is them investigating this history of mathematics and what is really going on in terms of the minor key, the nomadic, in relation to the state appropriation of it. Very much how the state takes up the war machine and tries to, take it over, right? And what then the defense is, right? So he goes on. Finally, it is true of the hydraulic motor, and I mentioned this to you, for it is certain that the state itself needs a hydraulic science. There's no going back on Wittvogel's thesis. This is the author, a Frankfurt School peripheral member, Oriental Despotism, on the importance of large-scale waterworks for an empire. Yeah, brilliant book, by the way, worth reading, called Oriental Despotism by Franz Wittfogel. But it needs it in a very different form because the state needs to subordinate hydraulic force to conduits, pipes, embankments. And, this is worth thinking through because of the water situation now, not only from Flint, Michigan, but, still 2/3 of the world doesn't really have normal drinking water, when you really think about this, right? Which prevent turbulence, which constrain movements to go from one point to another and space itself to be striated and measured. Again, back to the chess analogy of space, right? Which makes the fluid depend on the solid and flows proceed by parallel laminar layers. The hydraulic model of nomad science in the war machine consists, on the other hand, in being distributed by turbulence across a smooth space, right? In producing a movement that holds space and simultaneously affects all of the points, instead of being held by space in a local movement from one specified point to another. Menachismus, Archimedes, Vauban, Desargues, Bernoulli, Monge, Carnot, Poncelet, etc. In each case, a monograph would be necessary to take into account the special situation of these savants, scientists, whose state science used only after restraining or disciplining them, very interesting, after repressing their social or political conceptions. So the relationships of science and politics and epistemology and the war machine are now being laid out. Very interesting. yeah. And David, going back to what you were saying earlier about drones, right? This is part of the drone warfare. Think about what drones really could do for us. Instead, now we have drones, that are, targeted assassins, inhuman targeted assassins, right? That can be used. And it's just a matter of time before, they were going to use drones as security in these high schools. There's a huge moment about this. This is another thing, right? That's going to be happening, right? So this would be a great, droneonology would be a great moment here again. Virillo went there for a little bit, but didn't really flesh it out. The interesting thing about Paul Virillo, Richard Alliez is with us, but anyway, he was a minister in the Defense Department, in the French Defense Department. And they write books, unlike our people who go on TV after their careers are up and, get gigs on CNN or MSNBC or Fox or whatever, depending on their political inclinations, But anyway, it's interesting, how this worked in Europe. So anyway, let me just go on. The sea as a smooth base is the specific problem of the war machine. And we see this in the Ukrainian war. What does Russia really want here? I mean, yeah, of course they want their language. They want denazification. You have all the rhetoric. What? They want the sea. They want the sea. David, you mentioned the British Empire. What did the British Empire excel at? The sea. No accident that J. Paul Getty and Greek ship owners used London as their headquarters. No accident to me that London and Canary Wharf became the trading post of world finance, right? In many ways. They had this notion of a very long history, right? Lloyd's of London created it to take care of the pirates, to take care of the war machine. This is what it was about. That was the story. Yeah, in many ways. And if you begin to look at, again, we don't really do this in philosophy departments, Patrick knows this, but if you begin to look at the histories of Mill, Locke, a lot of these people, who they worked for, what they were involved in, you begin to see a very different crystallization about the use of philosophy in the world, right? And in a way, these people are on to something between royal and, and nomadic science, right? So anyway, this is interesting. I also recommend highly, I mean, I know there's only so much time in the day, but the book on the Chora, C-H-O-R-A, on the beginning, receptacle, by a man named John Sallis, first-rate philosopher. It's a reading of the Timaeus. It's really, really good. Yeah. John Sallis, S-A-L-L-I-S. He's a very good writer. Most technical philosophers are not good writers, but he's a very good writer on top of everything. I think he just retired from Vanderbilt. But anyway, yeah. Okay, so let's go on here. So Virillo shows it is at sea that the problem of the fleet in being is posed. In other words, the task of occupying an open space with a vertical movement that can rise up at any point. In this respect, the recent studies on rhythm or on the origin of that notion do not seem entirely convincing. For we told that rhythm has nothing to do with the movement of the waves. Well, you can ask my friend, the musician here in Montreal, about that. That's all she does, is listening to the waves, right? And picking up on, but rather that it designates form in general and moves specifically the form of a measured cadence movement. However, rhythm is never the same as measure. And though the atomist Democritus is one of the authors who does speak of rhythm in the sense of form, it should be borne in mind that he does so under very precise conditions of fluctuation, and that the forms made by atoms are primarily large, non-metric aggregates, smooth space such as the air, the sea, and even the earth. There's indeed such a thing as measured cadence rhythm relating to the coursing of a river between its banks or to the form of a striated space. But there is also a rhythm without measure, which relates to the upswell of a flow, In other words, in the manner in which a fluid occupies a fluid space. So very interesting. You can think of the poet Dylan, I'm just so contentedly watching the river flow, right? What's the matter with me? I don't have much to say, I said, I'm looking at the river. So this is very interesting, not stepping into the same river twice, the Heraclitean maxim. You begin to see this kind of, again, this engagement that Heidegger has, pointed towards with the pre-Socratics, and now the atomists taking place in terms of thinking through something against the dominant royal science, right? To create this nomadic science in a very different way. Yeah, it's coming out. And we don't get this. We don't get this at all. It's very, 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 very strange that we don't, right? In a sense. This opposition, or rather this tension limit between two kinds of science, the nomadic, this is page 364, war machine science and war machine science, and the royal state science reappears at different moments and different levels. The work of Annie Querion enables us to identify two of those moments. One is the construction of the Gothic cathedrals. I have her book. It's a very good, anyway, in the 12th century. And the other, the construction of bridges in the 18th and 19th century. And those of you that know the essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking of Heidegger and the bridge that he talks about, very interesting as well, how he goes through this. Gothic architecture is indeed inseparable from a will to build churches longer and taller than the Romanesque churches, even further, even higher. But this difference is not simply quantitative. It marks a qualitative change. The static relation form-matter tends to fade into the background in favor of a dynamic relation, material-forces. It is the cutting of the stone that turns it into material capable of holding and coordinating forces of thrust and of constructing even higher and longer vaults. The vault is no longer a form, but the line of a continuous variation of the stones. It is as if Gothic conquered a smooth space, while the Romanesque remained partially within a striated space in which the vault depends on the juxtaposition of parallel pillars. But stone cutting is inseparable from, on the one hand, a plane of projection at ground level, which functions as a plane limit, and on the other hand, a series of successive approximations, squaring, of placings and variation of voluminous stones. Of course, one appealed to the theorematic science of Euclid in order to found a foundation for the enterprise. Mathematical figures and equations were thought to be the intelligible form capable of organizing surfaces and volumes. But according to the legend, Bernard de Clairvaux quickly abandoned the effort as too difficult, appealing to the specificity of an operative. Archimedean geometry, a projective and descriptive geometry defined as a minor science, more a mathography than a mathemology. His journeyman, the monk mason Garin de Torres, speaks of an operative logic of movement that enables the initiate to draw, then hew the volumes in penetration in space to make it so that the cutting line propels the equation. One does not represent, one engenders. I like this very much. Instead of modeling, one engenders and traverses. Very nice, yeah. This science is characterized less by the absence of equation, but then by the very different role that they play. Instead of being good forms, absolutely, that organize matter, they're not generated as forces of thrust by the material. In a qualitative calculus of the optimum, right? Very interesting. They are generated, as forces of thrust by the material in a qualitative calculus of the optimum. The whole current of Archimedean geometry was taken to its highest expression, but was also brought to a temporary standstill by the remarkable 17th century mathematician Desargues. By the way, a very good chapter on him in Derek, what's his last name? I'm blocking on that. Dirk Struick's History of Mathematics, a resident of Massachusetts like Patrick. He wrote on whaling too, but the Short History of Mathematics, excellent book, has a whole section on this this moment in the 17th. He wrote little. He nevertheless exerted a great influence through his actions and left outlines, drafts, and projects centered on problem events. And this is interesting, the problem event, right? Lamentations, draft project for the cutting of stones, draft project for grappling with the events of the encounters of a cone and a plane. He, however, was condemned by the Parliament of Paris, of course, right? Opposed by the King's Secretary. His practices of perspective were banned, right? Royal or state science not only tolerates and appropriates stone cutting by means of templates. We have this in academia, template scholasticism, the model that people impose and then write, they fill in, right? There's nothing going on in terms of the cutting, the stone cutting, the movement qualitatively in thought at all. It's all template. And this is 80% of the scholarship in the humanities today, to my mind. I mean, I glance at a lot of stuff. I pick up on the patterns pretty quickly. Yeah. So, which is the opposite of squaring, right? Under conditions that restore the primacy of the fixed model of form, mathematical figures, and measurement. Royal science only tolerates and appropriates perspective if it is static, subjected to a central black home. And you want to look at downtown Brooklyn. I mean, some of you live in downtown Brooklyn or nearby. You can see this at work. I mean, this new stuff. I mean, it's awful. It's the worst example. I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's going on. Yeah, divested of its heuristic and ambulatory capacities, right? But the adventure or event of Desargot is at the same time that it already occurred during the Gothic Germany on a collective level. Not only did the church in its imperial form feel the need to strictly control the movement of this nomadic sect, it entrusted the Templars, and this is where it gets interesting, with the responsibility of determining its locations and its objects. Speaking of police, David Winters, the Templars back in, I guess he left, but anyway, or is it not? Okay, governing the work sites and regulating construction, but the secular state in its royal form turned against the Templars themselves. Banning the guilds for a number of reasons, at least one was the prohibition of this operative or minor geometry. If Edgar is right to find another echo of the same story in the case of bridges, doubtless the conditions were very different. The division of labor, according to state norm, was an accomplished fact. But the fact remains that in the government agency in charge of bridges and roadways were under a well-centralized administration, while bridges were still the object of active, dynamic, and collective experimentations. And it goes on to talk about this. I won't give you the whole thing, but it goes through the history of the school of bridges and railroadways. The plebeian corps was subordinated to the school of the mines, the schools of public works, and the polytechnic was not left to its own devices. And we see this in academia today, how schools are being subordinated in vocational training, job readiness, all of this, how thinking is completely out of the curriculum. We're beginning to see this in the name, of course, state needs, right? So what is a collective body? Next page, 366. Undoubtedly, the great collective bodies of the state are differentiated in hierarchical organism that on the one hand enjoy a monopoly over a power of function, and on the other send out local representatives. They have a special relation to families because they link the family model to the state model at both ends and regard themselves as great families of functionaries, clerks, intendants, or farmers. Yet it seems that in many of these collective bodies, something else at work that does not fit into the schema. It is not just their obstinate defense of their privileges, it is also their aptitude, even caricatural or seriously deformed, to constitute themselves as a war machine, following other models, another dynamism, and nomadic ambition against the state. As an example, there's the very old problem of the lobby, a group with fluid contours whose position is ambiguous in relation to the state it wishes to influence, and the war machine it wishes to promote, to whatever it means. A body is not reducible to an organism any more than the spirit of the body is reducible to the soul of the organism. Spirit is not better, but it is volatile, whereas the soul is weighted. It's the center of gravity. Must we invoke a military origin of the collective body and the spirit of the core? Military is not the part that counts, but the distant nomadic origin. And this is another great thinker of the Islamic. Ibn Khaldun defines the nomadic war machine. This is in his philosophy of history, the Islamic thinker, historian, and philosopher, by families or lineages plus spirit of the body, esprit de corps. The war machine entertains a relation to families that is very different from its relation to state. In the war machine, the family is a band vector instead of a fundamental cell. A genealogy is transferred from one family to another according to the aptitude of a given family at a given time to realize the maximum of agnatic solidarity. Here, it is not the public eminence of the family that determines its place in the state organism, but the reverse. It is the secret power or strength of solidarity and the corresponding genealogical mobility that determine its eminence in a war body. This has to do neither with the monopoly of an organic power nor with local representation, but is related to the potential of a vortical body in the nomadic space. Of course, the great bodies of a modern state can hardly be thought of as Arab tribes. What we wish to say, rather, is the collective bodies have always been fringe or minorities that reconstitute equivalents of the war machine in sometimes quite unforeseen forms, specific assemblages such as building bridges, cathedrals, and rendering judgments, or making music, instituting a science, a technology. Collective bodies of captains, asserts demands, etc. Always periods when the state as organism has problems with its own collective bodies, when these bodies, claiming certain privileges, are forced in spite of themselves to open onto something that exceeds them, a short revolutionary instant, an experimental surge. A confused situation many times occurs. It is necessary to analyze tendencies and poles, the nature of these movements. All of a sudden, it is as if the collective body of the notary publics were advancing like Arabs or Indians, right? Then regrouping and reorganizing a comic opera, which you never know what is going to happen next. Even the cry, the police are with us, sometimes is heard. Kind of interesting, huh? That's good. It's cool. Yeah. Husserl speaks, and this is where he goes into phenomenology. I know we've been, I was going to tell Jane, David, and Chris Miller, I think the ones that came late, and David Winters. Next week, we're going to start at 7. The people seem to be more comfortable with that time. If you guys are, David, is that good for you, Salvador? Yeah. Does that work better? Yeah, probably better, huh? Yeah,
yes,
okay,
it's
great.
better in the summer.
Excellent, good. Okay, so 7 to 9 or 9:30. You know, we're almost 9 o'clock when we started at 6:10 tonight. But anyway, all to say, so they go on. You know, new labor power. The two models of the science. This is page 369. I'll just skip forward a little bit. We can pick up more of this next week, a couple of other things. I think the numbering assemblages are all very important here too in the nomadology. Again, for me, the learning here, at least to me, the lesson to be drawn or the multiple lessons to be drawn is how to think through a thought war machine at this point that is against this royal science, against the state apparatuses, et cetera, et cetera. How do we really think this through and make it, you know, applicable in our world? You know, Stiegler had his notions. This maybe empowers in a different way, and this is more on the level of those who are much more marginal, you know, in a way, you know, going forward. But let me just say this: the two models of science, right? After the manner of Plato and the Timaeus, this is page 369. One could be called the compars and the other the dispar. The compars is the legal or the legalistic model employed by royal science. You know, Okay, the search for laws consists in extracting constants, even if those constants are only relations between variables, that is, equations. An invariable form for variables, a variable matter of the invariant, such as the foundation of the hylomorphic schema. But for the disparate, and this is a very interesting moment in both Deleuze and one of my teachers, Rainer Sherman, the disparate signifiers, that are playing out. As an element of nomad science, the relevant distinction is material-forces rather than matter-form, the old Aristotelian notion, right, of matter-form. So material-forces versus matter-form. Hence, it is not exactly a question of extracting constants from variables, but of placing the variables themselves in a state of continuous variation. This is not child's play what they're doing here, obviously. This is very serious business and weaponizing thought in a very different way. If there are still equations, there are adequations, inequations, differential equations, irreducible to the algebraic form and inseparable from sensible intuition of variation. They seize or determine singularities in the matter instead of constituting a general form. They affect individuation through events or hecinities, which is a term used by Duns Scotus, the thisness of things, right? Not through the object as a compound of matter and form. Vague essences are nothing other than hecinities. In all these respects, there's an opposition between the logos, the Greek word for, not for word as the Christians translated it, but the Greek word for reason, giving it an account of the logos, right? And the nomos, the law and the nomos, prompting the comment that the law still savors of morality, right? Now we're Nietzsche, right? This does not mean, however, that the legal model knows nothing of forces, the play of forces. That it does is evident in the homogeneous space corresponding to the compares, to the comparisons, but it's comparative here. Homogeneous space is in no way a smooth space. On the contrary, it is a form of striated space, the space of pillars. It's interesting how homogeneous space becomes the space of pillars, and it is striated by the fall of bodies, the verticals of gravity, the distribution of matter into parallel layers, the laminar and laminar movement of flows. So anyway, I'm not going to read all of this, but the nomos and the dispar is different in terms of the straight line, and then the new field that is opened up in science that he's going to talk about, Deleuze and Guattari will talk about the model of gravitational forces affirms more of the excess that's lodged there. And they go give examples from chemistry. Then the next section is about, and we can go back to this, of course, when we oppose speed and slowness, the quick and the weighty, celeritas and gravitas, right? Very interesting, speed and slowness, right? And he goes